This is Dennis Nayer, the Director of Research, Development, and Training for the New York State Association of Chiefs of Police. And right now I'm here with Greg Veitch. Greg is the Chief of Police for the city of Saratoga Springs, New York. And we're going to use this podcast to talk about not only policing in Saratoga Springs, but a book that Greg has written. So, Greg, welcome and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So first, can you just kind of talk about a good way to describe Saratoga Springs as a city for the listeners?
Sure. So a small city in upstate New York. We've got about a 30,000 population level, and of course we have the domestics and the calls for service that everyone else does. What makes Saratoga a little bit unique is the large influx of population in the summertime. Between the track and our downtown district with all of the bars we have, we stay pretty busy. And like almost everybody else, we're probably understaffed, but we try to work with what we have. And the track comes every year, so we can't be surprised by it.
Yeah, and I have to say that I enjoy the track and coming up here and seeing Saratoga Springs, and it's an awesome city, and it is never not busy. That's what every time I've come here, you're always really busy with lots going on.
Yeah, it's even in my career for the last 22 years, it's really, the summer season has started to expand. It used to be just the 4 or 5 weeks that racing was here, and now basically from Memorial Day all the way till maybe mid-October when the real first cold snap comes. We're busy right up until then, and like everybody else, we have a city calls for service, and we also have our tourist problems that we have.
And it's funny, I came here about a week ago after track season ended, and I thought I'd have no trouble finding a parking space. And I was wrong because, like I said, it's plenty busy.
Sure.
What inspired you to write a book? And that's really what we want to talk about. If you can talk to the listeners about that.
Sure. My family's from Saratoga Springs, and Saratoga has always been a tourist destination, and everybody's always thought of it as like sort of the playground of the rich and famous. Make a long story sort of bearable here. I had a great-grandfather who, a family legend has it, that he was involved in a gangland murder in the 1930s here in Saratoga Springs, where a guy was shot and dumped at the hospital. So I kind of knew that story as a little kid. Somebody told it, one of my relatives told it to me, and years later, I had put it out of my mind. I just kind of knew this cool story about my great-grandfather. Years later, when I was the detective lieutenant for Saratoga, I had occasion to be down in the archives. And I'm a little bit of a history buff anyway, so I opened up the oldest box that we had, and lo and behold, the oldest case file we have is murder of a guy in the 30s who was shot and dumped at the hospital. And I kind of looked at that story, and my great-grandfather's nowhere near it. But that story is an unsolved gangland murder in the 1930s in Saratoga that involves, I think, the revenge killing of 3 informants by the Canadian Mafia. So that was kind of a really cool story. And I put together a presentation. I did it for the History Museum here in Saratoga. And at the end of it, somebody walked right up to me and said, "Hey, you should write a book." Now, researching that story, I learned all these other stories about Saratoga that paints a very different picture than what we think of Saratoga today as this sort of quiet, clean tourist destination. There was a lot of illegal gambling, brothels, some really amazing criminal stories, evidence being stolen out of the police station by the gamblers, a connection to the 1919 fixing of the World Series, Arnold Rothstein, Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, all those guys were here, and it makes for a nice long story of Saratoga Springs. I cut it off right before Prohibition because, frankly, if I kept writing all the way through Kefauver, it would have been an 800-page book. Nobody reads that. So I wrote the first book, and we'll continue on with the rest of the story at some point in the future.
So to say that Saratoga has quite a long history is an understatement, to say the least.
Oh, yeah. I mean, from the founding of the track in the 1860s all the way up until really, Kefauver in the early 1950s. Saratoga was just an open haven for gambling, illegal gambling. And the stories that of course, go along with that, when you can dig them out of the historical record, they make for a really cool story about this place that so many people have come to visit and love, and that, a lot of us live here and we love this city. But it paints a different picture of what was really going on back then as opposed to today.
So, as your book talks about Saratoga as, obviously a city rich with a history of gambling and things other than what the general public sees daily, how is it to police this city? Obviously, you have a racino, you have the track, you have that history. How is that policing-wise?
Well, our challenge is the same challenge many of my colleagues have, is how are we going to manage our budgets, be understaffed, and still deal with all the calls for service and what's expected of police, today. And one of the interesting things I found in writing this book and how we deal with things today is, the expectations of what the police did before, let's say, the 1940s and 50s was completely different than what we expect today. I mean, nobody really expected the police to go out and actually shut down these places. You would need a civilian complainant. You would need somebody to sign a warrant, an informant to sign a warrant, a known informant. Really, the police didn't go and do that kind of stuff. And that was really kind of interesting to me, is how if you look through the lens of today, of what we expect for police, you would look back then and say, my goodness, what the heck was going on, not just here in Saratoga, but everywhere. But when you realize, the first police forces weren't even established until the latter half of the 1800s, of course in 1860 nobody was going around shutting down these places. So, my challenges today, like I said, with everybody budgeting, how we're going to respond to calls for service, cut down our overtime. Officer wellness is a big thing, for me and everybody else. Is can't just have officers working, ungodly amounts of overtime. So, those things, I have the same problems everybody else does, but it's kind of unique to work in the city with that long history of gambling. Because I'll walk down the street during a parade, and then somebody will want to talk about, hey, remember, Matty Burns, who used to run the Chicago Club. And people still remember it, and they still kind of talk to me about it, and it's a lot of fun when that happens. And, of course, I'm not naive enough to think that there's no illegal gambling going on still in Saratoga, but it was a different thing. They ran the doors wide open, with sometimes police officers working as doormen.
So the 21st century policing that obviously you fully embody here is very far different than it was back in that day.
Oh, sure. And there's in the book there's two stories that really illustrate the differences. We have a wonderful restaurant down here in Saratoga Springs called Jacob and Anthony's. Well, that's on the same spot as one of our former jails. In the old jail was the back of a saloon. You would have to walk through the bar to lodge your prisoners. And of course, the guy running the jail gave the people whiskey instead of water, so he would have a continual customer base. They'd go out just as drunk as they came in, and each night they would just keep shuffling through. And then the other story is a story about a murder of a constable back in the 1860s, which really highlights how policing was done. Civilians were the ones who were doing the investigation, gathering the evidence, and then once the warrant was issued, it's handed to a constable. Well, they go to make the arrest, and one of them gets stabbed and killed. The constables weren't doing the investigation. It just kind of highlights the difference of what was going on then as today. And like I said, that stuff's not happening in Saratoga Springs today. Our jail is up to standards, but those things we don't usually associate with Saratoga Springs when we visit here today.
It's always really nice to learn the actual history and the backstory of any place, and Saratoga is extremely rich with it. In your book, I know you mentioned about the Canfield Casino,
Sure.
And now that is not a casino, but it's actually an event center. Yep. And if you could tell the listeners a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, the Canfield Casino was built by John Morrissey initially, and John Morrissey was a sitting congressman. He was a gambler. He was a bare-knuckle heavyweight boxing champion. And if you know the movie Gangs of New York, the Daniel Day-Lewis character is loosely based on John Morrissey. And John Morrissey came to Saratoga Springs. He built the track. He was looking to have not only the gambling money during the day from the track, but he also wanted a high-end casino at night. He actually built the Canfield Casino in Congress Park. Canfield eventually took it over, and he ran it up until 1907. When he left, the city purchased the property, and that became part of Saratoga Springs Congress Park. And sooner or later, the History Museum took over, and they've been there ever since. I think the History Museum's been there for almost 100 years now. But they have events there. People have weddings there, and it's the upstairs part of it is the museum.
Well, this sounds like a book that anyone who's interested not only in history of Saratoga, but history itself and some of the stories that have occurred here would definitely enjoy reading. Where can people find a copy of your book?
Yeah, locally at the Northshire Bookstore. That's right on Broadway. If you happen to be in town, you can pick it up there. Or you can go to northshire.com. That's their online, where you can purchase online from them. But I also have a website. It's called gangstersofsaratoga.com. And you can order the book directly through me. And if you send me an email, I can certainly sign it or or send it off to wherever. So,
And the actual title of the book for the listeners?
right, the book is called "All the Law in the World Won't Stop Them," and it's about 100 years worth of gambling, crime, and corruption in Saratoga Springs. And towards the end, we have some national figures come in here, and that's kind of an interesting story in itself.
I think anyone who purchases that book is going to enjoy reading it, and I'm looking forward to reading it in its entirety. Chief Veitch, thanks very much for your time, and we look forward to having this podcast up very soon.
Sure, thanks for having me.